Joining me here in our Washington studio is Sourabh Gupta. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. So Sourabh, first, your reaction to what we've seen from this summit: $60 billion in loans, in investments over the next 3 years. How significant is this for the African continent?
I think it is very significant for the African continent. And the most useful part for me, I think, is just to observe China's continuing commitment to Africa and continuing commitment to scale up its involvement with Africa. First, a couple of years back, a decade back, it was much of it was to do with the resource trade. Now, as China itself is moving up the value-added ladder and is trying to become a high-tech manufacturing power and a more consumption-oriented society, there's a lot of very productive industrial capacity which is now seeking a home in other developing countries in the south, which have an enabling legal environment in which they can operate. So we have a lot of investments going to places like Bangladesh, going to places like Vietnam, and Africa is primed to get a lot of that investment in low and medium tech, labor-intensive, export-oriented products which can go back to China.
Well, you talk to African leaders and you talk to Chinese leaders. Both sides say this is a win-win situation. Clearly, African nations have a lot to benefit from this, but we have to address the criticism here that China is trying to spread its sphere of influence in the region, and it's basically turning the region into a new form of colonialism. These African nations are sinking in debt. How would you address those concerns?
What I would say, first of all, is the investment which goes into infrastructure. That must be infrastructure which will help build Africa's productive capacity. So it cannot just be bridges to nowhere. It must be bridges in infrastructure which helps build that productive capacity. But let me look at this slightly differently. I know a lot of the criticism is coming from America. Now, think of what made America great in the 20th century. What it did was it provided a navy which provided security and safety of sea lanes, which allowed resources to travel to what was, sorry, yes.
No, and Sourabh, we
yes.
really do want to get into the U.S. perspective on this and multiculturalism versus protectionism. I had to cut you short in your previous answers. We were talking about some of the criticism that China has received, and you were saying much of that criticism is actually coming from the White House, from the United States.
From the United States. And part of the criticism is that these ventures are being used, of course, we talked about the debt, creating excess debt, but also this being used just as nakedly for geopolitical means and to gain influence. But what I would say in that regard is, think of the United States in the 20th century with regard to the rise of Asia, the Asian tigers. What the US did was guarantee the sea lanes, the security of sea lanes, so that resources could go to these countries. America provided investment and managerial know-how to these countries. These countries were able to fire up their economies. They were able to export to the United States. In a way, that's exactly what China is doing in Africa. And if they gain influence from that, so be it. And it's not a bad thing at all. It's a
well,
good thing.
Clearly a lot has changed since then. The U.S. thinks much differently than China, whether it's Agenda 2063 for Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The overall riding theme seems to be, in much of the world, maybe not the United States, that multilateralism is a good thing, that cooperation is a win-win thing. But the Trump administration clearly does not see it that way. I just want to get your take on that. Is the United States finding itself more and more isolated because of that position?
Yes, it is finding itself more and more isolated. And I would also broaden this out. In the Western world, there is a great degree of negativity towards free trade, towards globalization. And globalization is not just about the trade, but also migrants, et cetera, et cetera. And we see those xenophobia in parts of Europe also. And of course, Mr. Trump has talked not just in terms of in an anti-trade way, but also against immigrants and Mexican immigrants in this country. Africa has suffered from Mr. Trump's America First policy also, in the sense that I think Rwanda was one of the star performers out there, but Rwanda also gets preferences from the United States. And the United States had particular demands in that regard, and the Rwandans said, hey, this is going to gut our own manufacturing capability, in which case the US removed those preferences. So we are seeing a very kind of a hardball attitude towards Africa, and this does not bode well. It also does not bode well that Mr. Trump wants to do all these arrangements in terms of bilateralism, because, I mean, America is strong, these are weaker countries.
Yeah, he does not like multilateral agreements.
He doesn't like multilateral agreements, but in the trade arena, the larger and the broader the agreements, ideally multilateral, but otherwise broad plurilaterals is the way to go, because you can get greater efficiency gains from the process.
So, Rob, where do you see the China-Africa economic trade cooperation in 5, in perhaps 10 years from now? And can it overtake China-US trade relations, of course, assuming the trade tensions and this trade war, they find some kind of resolution and consensus?
First of all, I think China and Africa already are much larger traders than it is between China and between Africa and the United States. So China is already that much larger. I think in the last 17 years, China-Africa trade has increased 17 times. And that space is just going to continue to grow. But where this goes in the next 5 years, as is being talked about at this conference, it's exactly in that dimension in terms of building Africa's autonomous development capability and its capacity to industrialize and to export to the Chinese market, and China providing not just large sums of money and construction and infrastructure, but also managerial know-how to that process. And I think that will be it's totally win-win for both sides.
All right, win-win. Sourabh Gupta, thank you so much.